I wanted to thank everybody that's joined us on this journey today through the Threat Intelligence Practitioner Summit track. We started off this morning with a discussion about how to train in the light and how to think about fewer secrets. We've talked about Operation In-Game and how law enforcement were making some different choices there about particularly making some different choices that they had not made before about things or that were relatively new. For example, like actually disinfecting victim machines. We had, different choices related to how we actually are using AI tools. We actually heard that several times about our choices about how we actually use AI tools. Samir raised a point about, thinking differently about certificates and how we actually treat certificates. We talked a lot about, coordinated disruption and some of the different things that we're doing to, go after a rat. We had, U2 and what we still can't find what we're looking for. We had analysis of impact of reports, like how do we actually think differently about the efficacy of actually putting out reports. The CTI panel talked about how you have to choose diversity and choose differently and how you think about making up your teams. Linda talked about how we're going to go about making some changes in the choices that we make about how intelligence comes into us. All of these examples today, Noah's description of like the way that they're choosing to do some things differently and parse and sift and go through IOCs differently. All this comes back around to the theme that I started with this morning, which is about choice. And so some of what I want to talk about in my wrap-up today is how we can think about and make some different choices in how we actually are doing threat intelligence sharing. So one of the things that is very true is that sharing is much harder than it looks. And my joke about CTA is the reason that we talked about threat intelligence sharing for so long instead of doing it is because doing it's really hard, and it's just much easier to talk about it. And if you actually did a review, which, by the way, one of my colleagues made his grad students go through and do a review for some students at Columbia, they went through and reviewed 30 years worth of cybersecurity reports and recommendations, and every single one of them said we should share more. Every single one of them. So you have to ask, if that is the recommendation, and yet we know that we're not where we want to be, we're still, we still haven't found what we're looking for, the question is why? Why is that actually the case? And I think really, when you actually look at it, there are three faulty assumptions that underlie this. Whoops, a minute. There are three faulty assumptions that lead to these poor outcomes. That didn't show up too well on this slide. But this says cyber threat information equals technical data. So the other one is that all organizations out there should share that technical data. And then the last one is that sharing is easy once once the connections are made. I call that the field of dreams fallacy. That's the, if you build it, they will share, right? And that just is also not the case. And so when you actually think about it, cyber threat intelligence consists of a lot more than technical data. In fact, we'll actually see in just a second that technical data is only one small part of what we need to be sharing. The second thing is most organizations cannot produce or consume that technical data. And in fact, we shouldn't even try. I grew up in the southeastern part of the United States, and so we had a saying that said, you can try to teach a pig to sing, but it will frustrate you and annoy the pig. In many cases, we're trying to get them to consume and produce technical threat intelligence is like trying to get a pig to sing. And then lastly, simply connecting the pipes is insufficient. It is not enough to simply make the connections there. That's a necessary predicate, but it is not sufficient. So if you actually start to think about the different categories of threat intelligence that we have, Um, what we often think of and what people immediately default to for threat intelligence sharing is actually this box right here, the indicators. But that's only one layer of the technical, tactical, operational, and strategic. If I'm an investment company and I'm actually looking at where I'm putting and where I'm concerned about my risk, I'm actually maybe much more interested in the strategic level of how the threat landscape is changing from a geopolitical standpoint. I may care a whole lot more about what somebody's assessment of the likelihood of China moving against Taiwan in the next 6 months is, as opposed to, the list of the latest hashes. And so you can see that there are different decision questions that we're actually asking on these different levels. And so from the CTA standpoint, we actually think about cyber threat intelligence in all of these different categories. And now, Samir, you're going to make me go add certificates to this slide. I didn't quite have time to do that, but that's going on here somewhere. But we've got all these different types, right? And some of these are at the technical level, and the box in red is what we currently share. But my goal for CTA is to actually start to extend us into these other categories. This is where I want to take us, into these other areas of cyber threat information sharing. How do we actually get more of the information about these different areas out there? And this is why I think you see us talking about the things that Linda hit on today about wanting to nail down this piece so that we have a very, very solid foundation to extend to the rest of these categories on the screen. Now, some of them we may never get a whole lot of, and that's okay. But if we can start to extend into these areas, then I think that will greatly improve the value to all of our members, but also value to the ecosystem as a whole. So the second faulty assumption is that, that all organizations try to consume technical threat intelligence. And if you sort of think about it, diverse organizations are going to need to consume different types of information. Sports teams and banks are going to use information very differently. And that means the cyber threat information they consume needs to also differ. And large enterprises and small nonprofits face different problems. In fact, we had, Martin Gruten was talking all of yesterday in this small talks about the different kinds of information that a nonprofit actually might need. And what they might need differs depending on whether you're talking about for headquarters or for people who are actually out in the field in sub-Saharan Africa with no regular connectivity, or people that are deployed into South America, into some of the urban environments there that, again, are different. And so I think that we as an industry don't do enough to think about how our customers, how our clients need to consume that threat intelligence that we're trying to produce, because they're all doing different things with it, and they need to actually make different decisions. And what I have found when you actually start to really look at the organizations that have succeeded at figuring out what to do with their threat intelligence, it's when they figured out how to make it relevant to the business decisions that they're making. Because again, to go back to what Suzanne said this morning, we don't care about the boxes, we don't care about the laptops, we care about the people and the businesses that are behind these. And they do it when they have the capability to do so. And so this is really what should be driving us, that relevance factor. And the truth is that most of the CTI that we're shoving around so much is utterly irrelevant to most of the organizations that are out there. It does not help them one little bit. And most organizations actually only need to make a few cybersecurity decisions. So relevance to the organization's business decision should drive that CTI sharing. And identifying needed information requires discipline and focus. Because if we try to get them to consume more than they can, it will fail. again, it'll annoy the pig. And, we won't, and then it'll actually make them refuse to, incorporate when they actually should. And so utility is what matters. So if most organizations cannot produce or consume technical CTI, then threat intelligence consists of what they should consist of what the organization consume. And most organizations have an extremely limited bandwidth for consuming CTI. And so that means we also have to put it into digestible units, which we're also not very good at doing as an industry. And most organizations, it turns out, have trouble sorting and triaging the information they do get and identifying what's important and what's not. I used to see this all the time in my government service days. One of the prime functions that my unit actually served for the White House was, in fact, actually triaging what had come in. And figuring out what was actually relevant to the policymakers. This is something I'm sure that Norcha lives on a very regular basis, right? Figuring out what's important from that massive information that's actually coming in. And we shouldn't expect our recipients to actually sort that. That's part of our job as an industry. And then lastly, I'll just say that information sharing requires investment. Many information sharing initiatives start and then fade away. And connecting the pipes does not guarantee success. And so high quality information sharing really requires four elements. And one of them you heard Ricard mentioned earlier today. It requires trust, right? It also requires money. Just flat out, it requires money to actually make it happen. It requires resources. It requires time and it requires attention. And so this is not something, again, that, I think Jen was talking about this, of why are we spending this money again, right? This is something that requires sustained attention and time and money and trust over time to actually make it happen. So a few things that I think about for making different choices in CTI sharing is the industry should broaden what it considers to be threat intelligence. And recipients' cybersecurity decisions should drive the format and content, not the sender. And comparative advantage comes from what you do with the intelligence, not, the raw intelligence itself. And it really requires this planning, long-term investment, and sustained commitment. So when I think about this when I give advice to companies that are looking at their cybersecurity teams, thinking back to, the discussion that we had with the panel, one of the key things that I always tell people is, what decisions are you trying to make as a company? And the truth is, for many cybersecurity companies, they actually don't even make they don't have a team, and many companies don't even have a team, and they don't even make any of these decisions. They outsource all of that to a provider. But if you're actually got a team and you're making some decisions, what decisions are you making? Are you making decisions about patching? Are you making decisions about, block lists? What are you making decisions about? And then you create and implement a plan to actually align that with your business needs. Are you actually trying to ensure that you can, keep your cyber insurance? Are you trying to lower the price of your cyber insurance? So, and then make that information sharing relationships a selection criteria for your cybersecurity providers. I call that the Jarvis rule for Jeanette. Because that is one of the key things that we talk about a lot for CTA. And then I think for security providers, thinking about this, oh good, the purple actually worked out on this screen. All right. Distinguishing between the CTI types will improve the sharing outcomes. But also, identifying your comparative advantage in cyber threat intelligence is important. And I will say that the hint, it's not the size of the raw pool of intelligence. If you sort of accept the fact that not everybody knows everything in cyberspace, then sort of trying to market yourself on the basis of the size of your threat intelligence is effectively like saying, buy my stuff because my inadequate pool of data is better than his inadequate pool of data. It's not a terribly persuasive argument. And then make sharing a performance metric for employees in the company. I'm going to actually talk about this for just a minute because this is actually one of my, this is actually something that I feel very strongly for the government in particular. But I think it's actually something that too many companies don't think enough about. If you want people to actually engage in a certain behavior, then you need it to be built into their performance appraisals. You actually need to build it into how you assess them as employees. And one of the things the government is really rotten at doing, based on my experience, is actually making sharing and working with the private sector or working across agency lines part of anybody's performance appraisal. No one is rewarded in our law enforcement agencies for working with the private sector. That is not how they are assessed. They are assessed on arrest rates, on case rates, on a whole bunch of things, none of which have anything to do with actually interacting with the private sector. Yet, we say in cybersecurity that that's what we want to have happen. And we talk about this in companies all the time. And so I think it's really important that if we want to have threat intelligence sharing be a core foundational process, then we've got to make it part of the performance metrics for both the employees and the company, or otherwise we're not going to get there. And then finally, we cannot focus exclusively on technology. In CTA's own experience, the technology is definitely important. How we work with Magellan is key. The technological processes that we have built are important. But actually, as you heard from Linda's talk today, a lot of what we were actually talking about was not so much the technology, but the underlying business rules that actually drive the sharing, right? The business rules for CTA are what make us work. The technology is important, but the business rules and the processes are often more important. Now, I also talk to governments a lot about what they can do. And one of the hardest lessons that governments have had to learn is this one right here, which is that for the most part, governments don't have a comparative advantage in generating technical threat intelligence signatures. They think they do, but they don't. And so this has been a hard lesson for governments to learn, how to shift into a different mode of thinking about their threat intelligence, which is their comparative advantage is an understanding in that triage problem, understanding which of those technical threat intelligence bits are actually important and which ones are associated with actors that we care more about, that we are actually more interested in, that are more dangerous, that pose greater threats to the overall environment. And so what you've seen actually over the last few years is something that I've been very pleased with from the US government standpoint is a shift into strategic and targeted warnings, into a shift away from simply pushing out technical indicators and focusing the things on that have augmented the cybersecurity information with intelligence information that actually marries that more carefully. And then what we really want governments to also do is be incentivizing that sharing of threat intelligence across the board. And so that's really where I wanted to leave things for today, thinking about the different choices that we can make in how we think about cyber threat intelligence sharing, and how we can work to take all of the good work that's been done here from all the different speakers and all the different, not just here in this track, but obviously the other tracks downstairs as well, and think about how we apply it better through this kind of lens. So that's my presentation to wrap things up for today, but I'm open. I have a few minutes left for questions if anybody has some.